10 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I've looked at this week. The first guy, Greg Joseph of the Minnesota Vikings. So Greg Joseph, he's a kicker I've recommended many times on the waiver wire this season, and he's pretty much a guy that gets 7 to 10 fantasy points each and every week. He's in a pretty high-powered offense over there in Minnesota, and the last 4 games for him have been very well. Week 5 versus Detroit, 17. Week 6 at Carolina, 8 fantasy points. Week 8 versus Dallas, 11. And Week 9 at Baltimore, 7 fantasy points. So right now, he's available in 68% of fantasy leagues, and he has another good matchup in Week 10 at the Los Angeles Chargers that give up the 5th most fantasy points to kickers. And we see a lot of teams get in the red zone and execute versus this Charger team. So right here, I think Greg Joseph is definitely a good add this week, and he's one of the better kickers this season in fantasy football. The next kicker is Graham Gano of the New York Giants. I know he's going on bye week, but he's definitely a guy I recommend and a guy to keep in mind here. Graham Gano's had some big fantasy days this season. So the last couple weeks for him, Week 7 versus Carolina, 15. Week 8 at Kansas City, 4. And Week 9 versus Vegas, 11 fantasy points. So right here, like I mentioned, Giants go on bye. But after that, he's good for the rest of the season, obviously, is Graham Gano. And he's one of the most accurate kickers in all of football. And right now, he's available in 77% of fantasy league. And that percentage will probably be even more after the bye week here. But he's definitely a guy to keep in mind and a guy to keep on the radar this week. The next kick is Brian Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints, they've had trouble at kicker for most of the season, but now they've got Brian Johnson over there. And the first 3 weeks here since he's played for the Saints, Week 7 at Seattle, 6 fantasy points. Week 8 versus Tampa Bay, 8 fantasy points. And Week 9 versus Atlanta, 9 fantasy points. So Week 10, a pretty decent matchup at the Tennessee Titans. That could be a grinded out type of ball game, in my opinion, for both teams, where I could see Brian Johnson once again getting 7 to 10 fantasy points. And he's a pretty accurate kicker as well, in my opinion. So this same team, they're trying to find ways to score. They're going to try to kick those long field goals as well if they could, because obviously their offense ain't operating at 100% without Jameis Winston. So right here, Brian Johnson's available in a whopping 97% of fantasy leagues, and he's definitely a kicker I would get this week. The next kicker is Zane Gonzalez of the Carolina Panthers. So Zane Gonzalez, I've mentioned him a lot over the last few weeks, but he's definitely a kicker contributing and being pretty good for fantasy football. He's available in 97% of fantasy leagues. And the last couple weeks for him, Week 8 at Atlanta, 15 fantasy points. And Week 9 versus the New England Patriots, 7. So Week 10, it's an indoor game at the Arizona Cardinals. Zane Gonzalez, one of his former teams. And I think he could get things done in that ball game, is Zane Gonzalez. I know this Panther offense has been struggling the last few weeks here, but he's still getting in field goal range, and he's still getting it through the upright. So he's definitely a kicker I would get on the wire this week. And the 5th and final kicker I would look to get is Michael Badgley of the Indianapolis Colts. So right here, we don't know when Rodrigo Blankenship's coming back for this Indianapolis Colts team. And to be honest, Michael Badgley's been pretty solid this season here for the Colts. And he was added in 21% of fantasy leagues last week. So a lot of people paying attention to him. And in Week 6, since he filled in for Rodrigo Blankenship, 8 fantasy points versus Houston. Week 7 at San Francisco, 7. Week 8 versus Tennessee, 7. And Week 9 versus the New York Jets, 9 fantasy points. So Week 10, another good matchup here for Badgley and the Indianapolis Colts versus the Jacksonville Jaguars at the 8th most fantasy points to kickers. So it wouldn't surprise me to see Badgley get anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points in that Week 10 ball game. And he's available in a whopping 75% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few kickers I look to get on the waiver wire for Week 10 of the fantasy football season.